how to create the Cookbook application in RubyMine. You see that we have JetBrains RubyMine 4.5.2 open. I understand there's a 4.5.3, so you may want to download that. But in order to start the project, one way to do it is to go to File, New Project, and we're going to call the project Cookbook 3. And then we're going to need to change the project type to Rails application. So we do that, and then we click OK. And it's going to take a minute, so I'm going to pause the recording while it finishes generating. Okay, and we see here that the Ruby interpreter that's specified is 1.8.7. We look to see if we have a different version of Ruby available here, and we don't. So what I'm going to do is go and browse for it. Now, by the time you do this, we may have actually fixed the configuration to find 1.9.2. But what we'll have to do here is go up and we'll find that we've got 1.8.7 there. So we'll just close that and we'll open this. Open this. There we go. Go to bin and then go to ruby.exe and select that and then click OK. And now we have the option to choose Ruby 1.9.2. There we go. Okay. Now we also need to pre-configure it for our correct database. And the default given here is MySQL. We're going to use SQLite, so SQLite 3. We select there and click OK. Okay, so a moment later you see that we have a couple of error messages here saying that the required gems for SQLite could not be found. So what we need to do is go to Tools and then Bundler and then Install. So we're just going to click on Install and it will take a minute and find the appropriate gems. This is another one of those operations that takes a few minutes, and we'll just pause the recording here and not wait for it to finish. So for you, you may have to wait quite a considerably longer period of time for your install to finish. We mentioned the gem file, but we didn't talk about the other files in the application. We have, first of all, the app folder, which contains controllers, models, views, and helpers, which we did mention last time, and mailers, which we haven't discussed yet. We've got config, the config directory that has various configuration files, including database YML, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Then we've got the DB folder, which is going to contain our migrate files, but doesn't contain them right now. And then another one that's of interest is the test folder, which we saw a little bit in class last week. And that's going to have various kinds of tests that we'll be talking about in more detail in the next lecture. Now we'd like to run the application and see if it actually works. Interestingly, we can start it running before we actually create any code. It's going to run as the default application that has basically no classes in it, no classes that are user designed. And we will run it now and see what happens. So click on the run icon there, and in a minute it will start to run. We should see something appear in the console window right now. Okay, so it says it's running. And now what we need to do is go over to our web browser and type in HTTP localhost 3000. And in a second there, whoops. Okay, I guess we did it a little bit too soon. Let's give it another try. There we go. Now it's running. So you can see that welcome screen, which I think we talked about last time. You need to use generators, and that's our next step. The next step is to actually create the classes, the code for the classes, and let's start with categories, and we'll actually start with categories. So what we do here is run Rails generator. You can also use Control-Alt-G to get here. And we need to enter a part of the generator name, which is going to be scaffold. Whoops. And there we go. And now we need to give generator arguments, which in this case is the fields that we want in our category. So we need to give the name, category, and then name : string, which is the kind of field that we want in our category. Okay. And then click on OK. And in a moment, this will generate our categories for us. Okay, so a moment later, it finishes with exit code 0. Now, as part of the category class, or part of the category, categories, we have models, a particular file called category.rb. Notice that it says very little here. It just says category inherits from active record. All of the material that we've got to fill in about the constraints and has many recipes, we need to fill that in ourselves. But the scaffold will get you started by putting in the outline of the class. Then you fill in the details. Now, if we go to controllers, we see that there is a categories controller. And it has all of the usual CRUD methods. It's got an index to just list all of the categories. It's got a show to show a particular category. Then it's got a way to create categories, edit categories, edit, update, whatever, and then it's got delete. So that's basic CRUD functionality that we have in the controller. We can also go to the views, and if we look there, we will see that there are several html.erb files associated with each of the functions, with create, update, read, and delete. And then we also have the partial form.html.erb, which we saw was to abstract away some of the detail that you need to put in all of the different kinds of views that you create for this class. So that's category, and we can then go ahead and generate our recipes class. So we can again go to Tools, Run Rails Generator. Scaffold is pre-selected for us, and then we will write in the generator arguments. And so it will now be recipe, and the first string will be a title :string, and then we have description, which will also be a string. You saw when we showed that on the screen in our previous lecture, you saw that it had basically a text box or a text line to be filled in. So that's a string. And instructions is bigger. That's a whole text box. And so the way we specify that is to say instructions : text. So now I will click OK, and in a moment this will run and generate our recipes class. Okay, so that is generating, as you can see, and it finished again with exit code 0. So now we can look at our recipes class. If we look at controllers, we now have a recipes controller, and lo and behold, it looks almost exactly like the categories controller. And we have a recipe.rb that looks almost exactly like the category.rb, and our views would be the same views that we have for the categories class. And that just illustrates that a scaffold is a way to get up the skeleton of code in a single operation. Then you can go and specialize it as necessary. And of course, in this application, one of the ways we needed to specialize it was to say that a recipe belongs to a category, and a category has many recipes. and then we needed to make small adjustments in the rest of the scaffolded code. Another thing you should notice about this is that Rails creates various forms of each class name. Class recipe here, because it is a class name, recipe is capitalized. However, the file name is not capitalized, recipe.rb, and that follows the general Rails convention for naming files. Then in views, we have folders called recipes and categories, so it's automatically pluralized. And notice that Rails knows how to pluralize most English words. It sometimes gets it wrong. For example, feedback, that's one that we use in Expertisa, where it pluralizes feedback to feedbacks, where really feedback is not pluralized in standard English. But a lot of these it does get right. And then when it creates the controllers, it calls them categories controller and recipes controller, so it knows to pluralize those two. So all of that is taken care of by Rails. You don't need to worry about what kind of names to use. So notice also that here we have application controller.rb, categories controller, recipes controller. But if we look at the class name here, what we see is recipes controller. So this is written in camel case, whereas the file name itself uses underscores. Okay, one thing we didn't look at so far is the DB folder. So let's close up app and look at DB. And now we see that in addition to seats.rb, there's a migrate directory, a migrate folder. And we see here that there are two files, one called create categories and one called create recipes. So let's take a look at them. And create categories tells us that we have a method called change, which is going to create a table in our database, and it's going to have a particular field in it, which is called name, and that's a string. And then it also has timestamps because, as I mentioned last time, we like Rails to automatically keep track of the time of last of creation and of last update, so that we can see when changes were made to our database. And we don't have to write code for that. Rails generates it automatically. So that's this one. And of course, create recipes is going to be a little bit longer because it's got 3 fields. So if we were to run this code, what this would do would be create tables in our database with the proper fields. Let's take a look at how we do that. We go to the Tools menu and then Run Rake Task. And then we look at a couple of tasks here. We have DB migrate, which will migrate the database to, if you don't give it any parameters, it will migrate it to the latest version as illustrated or is given by the files in the migrate directory. You can also tell it to migrate it to a particular time or particular version, and then it will take it to that point. Now, one important advantage of doing migration like this is that we can roll back the database as well as roll it forward. So if we have made a change to our application to use a new database table or a new field in the database table, and then decide that our design was wrong, we want to get the database back to the place that it was before. And so then we can do DB rollback as a rake task to roll it back to a previous version. And you can look up details in this and in the Rails documentation, such as the Rails guides online. And you have full flexibility to move your database forward and backward, so you're not doing anything destructive when you update your database. It's a very useful feature because if you didn't have it, there would be no way to get an application working the same way it was working before if you decide you didn't make the right change in the latest change that you made. Now, before we do the migration, we're going to have to make the changes to our model file that we made before. So we're almost ready to generate the database, but before we run our migrate task, we need to go to the models. So that would be app models, and look at our category files and make sure they're set up like they are supposed to be. So remember from last time that we said a category has many recipes, and that this model also validates that the name field is actually there. Okay. So that's it. Okay, good. So let's save that. And now go to recipe.rb. Recipe.rb has similar constraint. A recipe belongs to a category. And it validates 3 different fields, or actually 4 different fields. Okay, so we've got that all set. Now before we do the migration, there's one last step that we need to take care of. We need to go to the migrate directory and the create recipes file. And this file we have here is a recipes entry. And for each recipes entry, there is a key to a categories table. So we need to put an indication of that into the file. So the way to do that is just to say T references category, like that. And then that will tell the database when we generate it that there is a key from a recipes record to a category record. Okay, so now we're ready to go to run rake task, and we'll go to db migrate and select that. And so we always have a choice of which migration to go up to. Here we could go to create categories, which is our earliest migration, create recipes, which is our second migration, and that's the same thing as the latest migration, but the latest migration is chosen by default, and we'll just keep that default. And then we have also a choice of environment. You see here we could use development, production, or test to generate 3 different databases. I don't know if we mentioned it, but in Rails there are always 3 different databases that you can use at any point. The production database, which is designed for you to be using on the server that you're running. There's the development database, which you can use to make changes, develop code, fix bugs, etc. And then there's the test database, which you use for running tests. Since we are developing at this point, we'll leave this selected as development, and then we'll go and generate the database. And this is, again, going to take a minute or 2, so we'll be back when it's done. Unfortunately, you see that this process finished with exit code 1, which means there was an error. So let's scroll back and see what it was. And when we get to the very top, we see uninitialized constant rake DSL. Well, this is symptomatic of a version of rake that doesn't work right with the Rails version that we have. So what we need to do is go back to our gem file over here and type in a different version of rake, and it turns out that the right version to use is 0.8.7. So we'll save that, and then we want to go back to bundle install, or bundler, actually bundler update, and then we tell it to update rake here. So we'll do that. And in a minute, that will finish. Okay, so the bundle is updated. And let's go again and run db migrate. Okay, this is going to take a little while to load, so we'll just wait for a moment. Okay, now it looks like we're ready. Come on. There we are. Now we'll run the migration. And this time it finished with exit code 0. Okay, now if you remember from our initial Rails screen, there are a couple of changes that we need to make in order to get the application actually running. The first thing that we need to do is delete the index.html file. That's located in the public folder. We can open right here. And there's index.html, so I'll just right-click on that and say delete. Okay, so it's gone. Now I'm going to need to refactor in order to fix up the references to it. And it looks like that's done now. The other thing I need to do is go to the roots.rb file and tell what the initial page to load is. And so we'll change this code where it says welcome.index to categories.index, or categories:index. And here's the comment that says that we need to delete index.html. We've already done that, so let's get rid of the comment. Make this code executable. Now, if you remember from last time, we were going to want to look at our database and see what's in it. In order to do that, we're going to install SQLite Manager. So let's go back to our web browser and bring up a new window and look for SQLite Manager. And we're going to find it here. We are running Firefox, so all we need to do is just add it to Firefox. And that's going to complete pretty quickly. So we're going to install it. But we're going to have to restart Firefox. So it should launch in a second. Okay, to get the SQLite Manager running now, we go there. And it's going to try to ask us where the database is that we want to browse to. So we're going to go to Connect Database and then look at so that's going to be in the C drive. Okay, so we're going to go to Documents and Settings, and then Me, and then RubyMine Projects, Cookbook 3, DB, and we've got to change the type of the file to SQLite 3. That's what we're going to need. And there we've got development.SQLite 3. So now we see our database. There we go. Okay, so we can look at the categories table, for example, and recipes table, and we see the code for creating them. So we see that the recipes table is empty, and the same would be true of the categories table if we go to browse and search. Okay, well, let's see if our application works now. So we want to go back to our web browser and to the Rails window we had from before, and just refresh localhost 3000. And ta-da! Okay, so we get this template is missing error, and basically we browsed the web after we got this and found that there is a line in a particular file that needs to be commented out. So just looked at Rails documentation on the web, looked at Stack Overflow, I think where it's where we found this. So if we go to the config folder in environments, there is a file called development.rb. And within that file, there is a line that says config.action view.debug rjs. It's true. Our advice is to comment out that line. So we'll comment it out, save the file, and now we need to go stop the server. So we click on development.cookbook3 and then there to stop the server. And now we can go ahead and run it again. And click there, and now we will restart the server. Okay. So now it looks like the server is running again. So we can go back to the web browser and try to reload this page. It seems like the server is still starting up. But now we get listing category and new categories. Now, if you look at this, it seems like we're missing something. First of all, it doesn't say online cookbook at the top like it should. And then we don't have that line at the bottom that we should have that has like to list all categories and list all recipes. And if you remember, the reason for that is that we don't have the application.html.erb file with the information that it's required in it. So we're going to copy the information out of the file that we had in our Cookbook 3 directory and put it right after the yield here. So we'll link there, and now we should be able to reload the application and find our navigation information. So there we go. Listing categories. Whoops, looks like I've got it twice. So let's fix that by removing the duplicate text from our file there. So let's see, style sheet link all, Cookbook 3. So it looks like what we really need to do here is get rid of this there. And I think we wanted our file to say application online cookbook right above this. So we want to say online cookbook. And let's see, I'm going to make this Cookbook 3 because this is still in the header. And then in the body, we want to say online cookbook. And since there's a header, I'm going to capitalize it like that. Okay, so we want to save this and then go back to our browser and reload the page. And now we get online cookbook listing categories like it's supposed to look. Well, I guess actually we need a carriage return after new categories. So let's go right here, yield, and then do a break. Like that. And now we can go back to our web browser and reload, and we get that. Actually, I probably should have another break or a paragraph there just to make it look like the old version looked. We can do that without any trouble. And go back to the browser. Okay, now it looks exactly like it's supposed to look. Okay, so let's create a new category, and we'll call it beverages. So that'll be created. And now we'll create a new recipe. We don't have a yet. Okay, show all recipes. Taking a little time here. And there's a recipe. So let's create our new recipe. Our old standby, ice water, description, cool and refresh. So we almost get done with this, but then we realize that the drop-down for categories is not there. So what do we need to do? Well, I think we talked a little bit about this last time, but let's go take a look at our code and see what we need to add. So which controller are we going to need to add this in? Well, we're in a recipe, so we probably need to add something to recipes controller to make sure that the drop-down is listed. So actually we need to add something to the view code because it's the view that's going to display the form on the screen. So what I would like to do is go back to my code that we had from the app we wrote last time and go back to form.html.erb because of course this is going to be in the form regardless of whether we're creating or editing a recipe. And then we need to select these two lines, F label category, and then select recipe from category ID, find all the categories, etc. So let's go back there and put that in between the title and the description. So we'll put that code there and maybe pretty it up just a little bit. Okay, and let's save that. Okay, so now let's go back to our Cookbook 3 window and reload it and see what happens. And now we've got this. Unfortunately, we lost our description, but I remember it. Cool and refreshing. And of course, the category is beverages. It's the only category we have. So take ice cubes, place them in glass, and add water. And now we can create it. Okay. Now we can show our recipes and there they come. Okay. Okay, now we can go look at our database, and in categories we see that there was actually a beverage created. And in recipes we see that there is a recipe for ice water. Okay, let me create another category here. Now I've created I've created a new category and I've created a couple new recipes. So you can see them, and let's look back at the DB to see if they show up. So let's go back to categories, and we see there are two categories, beverages and dessert, and then there are three recipes, and of course they have primary keys 1, 2, and 3. So we can browse the database, but we can also run the Rails console and type in database commands directly. So let's go to Tools and then Run Rails console, and then we can click here and give it a moment to start up. And then we can type something like category.all to see all categories. So let's see. And again, we got to wait for a moment. And now it has listed the categories for us, beverages and desserts. So in addition to that, we might just do category find 1, or let's try find 2, and it might be a little bit more interesting. And then category number 2 is desserts. We can also say category find 2.recipes, and it will give us the 2 recipes that are in category 2, apple pie and strawberry shortcake, but we're going to have to scroll to the right to see that one. We can also create objects and work with them. So let's do C equal category dot new, and then we can see C dot name, I think it is, right? C dot name equals, let's say, main courses. And then if we want to make sure that it stays in the database, we can say save. Because before we do the save, it's just an object in our local workspace here. If we want to persist it to the database, we can say c.save, and then that generates the SQL insert statement for us and puts the object into the database where it will persist. So this is an example of object relational mapping. We have objects in our Java program that we persist to the database simply by doing a save. And then we can take the object, work with it in the Java program, once we do a find, and then we can change it in whatever way we want, and we can save it back to the database. So it lets us work with objects, lets us work with database fields, database objects transparently. We can work with them with with Ruby statement. So let's go back to the SQLite Manager and look at categories, and we see that main courses is in fact